I wanted to ask you, which is, how did you find your first 5 customers?
I'll give a little bit of insight into what I got wrong, and then I'll talk about how I actually got them. So,
Right.
I was doing product market. Well, I did probably 3 to 6 months of validation before I even built a line of code on kind of the solution and product once I brought my co-founder on board. And so for that, we had basically like mocks of what the potential solution would look like a prototype in Sketch back in the day, probably just today. And then we did a couple like surveys. And for that, I really reached out to like friends who they could share with like their, people at their companies and stuff. And it was amazing. Everyone was like, oh, if you build this, we will buy. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. We're going to build this and we're going to have like 30 customers out the gate and like problem solved. And, it's a home run. Well, it turns out we built it. And then going back to those customers, they're like, well, I'm going to probably have to get approval. And so that process was slow. I think we had like maybe one customer from that set actually buy and pull the trigger in that current state. Like people will tell you that they love what you're going to build. They won't necessarily buy it. So just be aware of that as you're kind of testing things. Like I would expect that to be a very normal process. So the question was like, okay, great. How do we go get customers? So I did a lot of like kind of creative, like outbound back in the day before a lot of these fancy tools. I would like use someone on Fiverr and try and like get them to help me build a list. So I would go, for example, on Salesforce's like the community, like they do like an MVP list every year of like their like most valuable, whatever, experts in the field. So I'm like, hey, can you help me get the contacts of these people? And then I would send out like emails to each of them, asking them for feedback. Like early on, it was more of like, hey, I want to get your feedback and then see if any of those, and one, that was helpful in itself, but also with those turn to leads. And I say people are really open to giving feedback when it's positioned as that. So that was like one approach, or, hey, I'm writing a piece of content, would love to like hear your thoughts, given XYZ, would you be willing to contribute? And then you kind of naturally bridge that connection. So early on, when I was just like truly just trying to like warm leads and like get in front of people, those are some of the tactics I employed.